In the echoing silence of the Egyptian hall of the Hermitage, they lie under the watchful gaze of thousands of visitors. Heavy sarcophagi made of black stone. For more than a century, the world was convinced that an ancient priestess lay in one of them. The hieroglyphs on the lid proclaimed it, and generations of scholars assured us of it. But one day, a cold beam from a scanner pierced both the stone and time, revealing a century-old deception. Beneath the burial shrouds lay a man. This discovery was the key to two mysteries: the story of a man whose identity had been erased forever, and a woman whose name had been mistakenly given to another. Two destinies, intertwined by crime and chance, are ready to speak. The State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, a majestic building on the banks of the Neva River, its walls housing millions of works of art, treasures of world culture, and evidence of bygone eras. Each of its halls is a portal to another time, another civilization. But there is one among them where time seems to have stood still, not for centuries, but for millennia. This is the Egyptian Hall. When you cross its threshold, the air seems to become denser. Sounds are muffled, and the light falling from the high windows takes on a golden hue, as if sifted through the sands of the desert. Here, in the heart of Russia's northern capital, dwells the spirit of ancient Egypt, a civilization obsessed with eternity and believing that death is only the beginning of a new, endless journey. The Hermitage collection is not as vast as those in Cairo or London, but each exhibit is a concentrated piece of history, full of mysteries and discoveries. And this story begins with the silent and formidable guardians who greet every visitor at the central entrance. Two monumental, massive sarcophagi made of dark, almost black stone. They stand here like two colossi that have survived the collapse of worlds and bear the weight of millennia. Their shapes are perfect, their lines are strict, and their surfaces are covered with rows of hieroglyphs, sacred symbols that were supposed to ensure eternal life and protection from the gods for the deceased. These sarcophagi are not just burial boxes. In ancient Egyptian culture, they were true houses of eternity, a microcosm that was supposed to protect the body and soul in the afterlife. They were made from the most durable and expensive materials, and their decoration was entrusted to the best craftsmen. The stone from which they were carved is grauwacke, an extremely hard rock that required incredible effort and time to extract and process. The mere sight of these giants is awe-inspiring. They weigh tons, and their cold, polished surface attracts the eye and makes one think of those who once rested inside. They are the largest monuments in the museum's entire Egyptian collection. Their silent grandeur dominates the space of the hall, causing visitors to slow down and speak in whispers. It seems as if they know something that is inaccessible to us, the people of the 21st century. They saw the rise and fall of great dynasties, witnessed wars and revolutions, survived tomb robbers and changes of religion. And then, after traveling thousands of kilometers, they ended up here, on the banks of the cold Nile, to become a silent reproach to our fleeting time. But if you look at them more closely, you will notice something strange. On their seemingly perfect surface, there are traces of deliberate damage. Some signs have been knocked down. Some names have been erased with cold, methodical cruelty. And this is not the work of time or careless looters. This is the trace of a deliberate, meaningful act of vandalism committed thousands of years ago. Who are these people whose tombs stand here? And what tragedy unfolded around their names that even the most durable stone could not preserve them for eternity. These stone guardians do not simply guard the peace of their long-gone owners, they guard a secret that the world's best Egyptologists have tried to unravel. And it is with this secret that we will begin our journey into the depths of time. Let's take a closer look at these scars left on eternity. The sarcophagi did not belong to just any noble Egyptians. They were created for members of the royal family who lived in the late period, during the 26th, or Saite dynasty. This was the last rise of independent Egypt before a long series of foreign conquests. One of the sarcophagi, the smaller one, was intended for a queen named Nathbastetru. She bore the title Wife of the god Amun, one of the highest and most honorable titles for a woman at that time. The second, more massive one was made for her son, a military leader and prince named Yakhmes. They were the wife and son of Pharaoh Yakhmes II, better known by his Greek name Amasis, one of the most powerful and prominent rulers of that era. According to Egyptian beliefs, a person's name was an integral part of their identity. To destroy a name meant to destroy the very person in the afterlife, to deprive them of the opportunity to be resurrected and gain eternal life. Therefore, the names and titles of the deceased were always carved with great care on sarcophagi. It was a magical guarantee of immortality. These traditions were observed on the sarcophagi of Nathbastetru and Yakhmes. The entire surface is covered with intricate carvings, images of patron gods, spells from the Book of the Dead, and, of course, cartouches, oval frames containing the names and titles of royalty. But it is here, in the most important places, that we see these strange, ugly damage. The names of the queen and the prince, their most important titles, have been knocked off. Someone took a chisel and a hammer and methodically, blow by blow, chipped away at the stone, turning the sacred hieroglyphs into shapeless depressions. The work was carried out with frightening thoroughness. These are not accidental scratches or chips from a fall. The parts of the text that contained personal information were damaged. The rest of the hieroglyphs, containing general religious formulas, remained untouched. This proves that the vandal knew exactly what he was doing. He read the hieroglyphs and knew exactly where to strike. His goal was not to destroy the sarcophagus, but to erase the memory of specific people, Nathbastetru and Yakhmes. This mystery has puzzled scientists for decades. It was first noticed by the outstanding Russian Egyptologist Vladimir Golenishtchev, the man who largely created the Egyptian collection in Russia. He understood that these were not just damaged artifacts, but evidence of some ancient tragedy, a historical drama. Who could have committed such sacrilege? Who dared to raise a hand against the tombs of the mother and brother of the ruling pharaoh? Tomb robbers usually worked quickly, interested in jewels rather than the painstaking destruction of inscriptions on multi-ton stone coffins. That would have been a senseless waste of time and effort. So there must have been another motive. Not greed, but a thirst for revenge. A revenge so strong that it haunted its victims even after their death. The answer was not to be found in the crime reports of ancient Egypt, but in the pages of its great and tragic history. We had to go back to a time when these sarcophagi were not yet museum exhibits, but stood in the semi-darkness of the tomb, awaiting the arrival of conquerors who would forever change the fate of the ancient country. It was there, in the smoke of fires and the clang of weapons, that the key to unraveling the mystery of the damaged names lay hidden. To understand the reason for this posthumous revenge, we need to go back to the 6th century BC. Egypt is ruled by the 26th dynasty, founded in the city of Suez in the Nile Delta. It was a time of revival, a renaissance of Egyptian culture. After a long period of decline and foreign rule by the Libyans, Nubians, and Assyrians, Egypt regained its independence and strength. The pharaohs of the Site dynasty sought to emulate their great ancestors of the Old and Middle Kingdoms in everything they did. They restored ancient temples, copied ancient texts, and revived forgotten rituals. The country prospered. At the height of this prosperity was Pharaoh Jahmès II, or Amasis, who ruled for a long time and, it would seem, happily. From 570 to 526 BC, Amasis was an outstanding ruler. He came to power as a result of a military coup, but proved to be a wise politician and a skilled diplomat. He maintained friendly relations with the Greek city-states, encouraged trade, and built magnificent temples. The arts and sciences flourished at his court. At that time, Egypt was one of the richest countries in the world. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt several decades after Amasis's death, wrote that it was under his rule that the country reached its peak of prosperity. It seemed that nothing could threaten this golden age. But clouds were gathering in the east. A new, unprecedented force was gaining power there. The Persian Empire of the Achaemenids. Founded by Cyrus the Great, this empire rapidly absorbed one state after another. Media, Lydia, Babylonia. Egypt remained the last major independent kingdom in the Middle East, and its conquest was only a matter of time. Amasis understood this perfectly well. He actively prepared for war. He strengthened his army, built a fleet, and formed alliances. He hoped that he would be able to stop the Persian invasion. It was in this atmosphere of outward splendor and inner turmoil that his wife, Queen Nathbastetru, and his son, the military leader Jahmès, lived. They were part of the ruling elite, enjoying luxury and honor, performing lavish rituals in temples, and, of course, preparing tombs worthy of their status. They ordered massive sarcophagi made of precious grauwacke, believing that these houses of eternity would protect them after death. They could not have imagined that their greatest enemy would come not from beyond the walls of the tomb, but with fire and sword to destroy not only their bodies, but also the very memory of them. In 526 BC, Pharaoh Amasis died without ever facing the Persian threat. He left the throne to his son Psammetichus III, and just a few months after the old pharaoh's death, in 525 BC, a huge army of the Persian king Cambyses II, son and heir of Cyrus the Great, invaded Egypt. The last days of the great dynasty were numbered. A new and terrible page in the history of the ancient country was beginning, and it is this page that explains why the names on the sarcophagi in the Hermitage were so cruelly destroyed. Before we move on to the story of the Persian conquest, let us pay more attention to those whose sarcophagi became the focus of our story. Queen Nathbastetru and her son, Prince Jahmès. Unfortunately, history has preserved little information about them, which is telling in itself. There was a real attempt to erase their memory, and to a large extent, it was successful. Most of what we know about them comes from these damaged sarcophagi. Nathbastetru was not the chief wife of Pharaoh Amasis. She was one of his wives, but she held the extremely important and prestigious title of Wife of the god Amun. In the late period, this title was given to unmarried daughters or close relatives of the pharaoh, and endowed them with enormous power and influence in Thebes, the ancient religious capital of Egypt. The wife of the god was considered the earthly embodiment of the wife of the supreme god, Amun-Ra, and ruled over huge temple estates, owning land and treasures. It was a position comparable in importance to that of the high priest. The fact that Nathbastetru held this title speaks to her high position at court. She was not just one of the women in the harem, but an important political and religious figure. Her sarcophagus, although smaller than her son's, is crafted with incredible skill, which also emphasizes her status. Her son, Iachmes, bore the titles Prince and Commander. He was one of the sons of Pharaoh Amasis, but apparently not the heir to the throne. The heir was his brother Psamtik III. Nevertheless, Iachmes held a key position in the army. With the Persian threat looming, the position of Supreme Commander was one of the most responsible in the state. It was his task to defend the borders of Egypt. His sarcophagus is the largest in the entire Egyptian collection of the Hermitage. Its monumentality was intended to reflect his power and valor. In addition to the standard religious texts, the walls of the sarcophagus probably listed all his military achievements and titles. It was these lists that were destroyed with particular care. Why did they provoke such fury? They were not just members of the royal family. They were symbols of the outgoing regime. Nathbastetru, as the wife of the god Amun, personified the religious power of the old dynasty and the might of the Theban priesthood, which had always viewed foreign invaders with suspicion. Iachmes, as a military leader, was a direct representative of the military force that was supposed to resist the Persians. He may have personally commanded the troops in decisive battles. The destruction of their memory is not just personal revenge. It is a political act. When a conqueror comes to a new land, he often seeks to destroy the symbols of the old power in order to establish his own. And what could be a more powerful symbol than the tombs of the most high-ranking officials of the state? By destroying their names, the conqueror was saying, "Your power is over. Your religion has been defeated. Your army has been crushed. You no longer exist in this world or the next." Thus, these two sarcophagi are transformed from simple funerary artifacts into witnesses to a brutal political struggle. These monuments commemorate not only two specific individuals, but also their entire era, the last flowering of independent Egypt, crushed by the ruthless military machine of the Persian Empire. In 525 BC, the Persian storm swept over Egypt. At the head of the Persian army stood King Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great. Unlike his father, who went down in history as a wise and merciful ruler, Cambyses had a reputation as a cruel, hot-tempered, and unstable tyrant. Ancient historians, primarily Herodotus, paint him in the darkest colors. The young and inexperienced Egyptian army, under the command of the new pharaoh Psamtik III, met the Persians at the border fortress of Pelusium, in the east of the Nile Delta. This is where the decisive battle took place. Herodotus and other authors tell a curious, though perhaps legendary, story about the cunning used by Cambyses. Knowing that the Egyptians revered cats as sacred animals of the goddess Bastet, he ordered his soldiers to place cats and other animals sacred to the Egyptians in front of the army. The Egyptians, afraid to harm the sacred creatures, did not dare to shoot their bows and did not fight at full strength. The battle was lost. The remnants of the Egyptian army retreated to the capital, Memphis. The Persians laid siege to the city, and after a short siege, Memphis fell. Pharaoh Psamtik III was taken prisoner. Thus, in just one battle, the centuries-old history of independent Egypt came to an end. Cambyses proclaimed himself the new pharaoh, founding the 27th Persian dynasty. Herodotus describes what followed as a series of madness and sacrilege. According to him, Cambyses, upon entering Memphis, mocked Egyptian religious customs. He entered the temple of the god Ptah and ridiculed his statue. He ordered the temple archives to be burned. His most famous atrocity, described by Herodotus, was the killing of the sacred bull Apis. Apis was the living embodiment of a god, and his killing was a terrible sacrilege for the Egyptians. It is said that after this act, Cambyses was punished by the gods and lost his mind. He executed the captive pharaoh Psamtik III and, according to rumors, ordered the tomb of his predecessor, the great Amasis, to be opened. According to legend, he wanted to desecrate the mummy, but could not distinguish it from the others and instead burned the body of a random person. Modern historians treat Herodotus's accounts with caution. Herodotus wrote from the point of view of the Greeks, enemies of the Persians, and probably exaggerated, relying on Egyptian priestly traditions that hated the conqueror. Archaeological evidence shows that Cambyses, at least at first, tried to follow tradition and was crowned as a legitimate pharaoh. However, there is no smoke without fire. Even if half of Herodotus's stories are fiction, it is clear that the Persian conquest was brutal and accompanied by acts of violence against the Egyptian elite and sacred sites. In this atmosphere of total destruction and humiliation of the old regime, the hypothesis of the deliberate destruction of the names on the sarcophagi of the royal family seems more than plausible. This was not mere vandalism. It was an act of state policy, a demonstration of power and total domination. The perpetrators could have been the Persians themselves, acting on Cambyses' orders, or Egyptian collaborators eager to curry favor with the new regime and settle scores with the old. Whoever it was, they acted in line with the general logic of conquest. To build something new, you have to destroy the old to its foundations. The names of Nathbastetru and Yakhmes were part of that old world and had to be consigned to oblivion. What happened to the names on the sarcophagi of Nathbastetru and Yakhmes is a striking example of a practice that the Romans would later call damnatio memoriae, curse of memory. Although the term itself is Latin, the phenomenon was known long before Rome and was particularly common in ancient Egypt. As we have already mentioned, for the Egyptians, the name Ren in Egyptian was one of the most important components of human existence, along with the body, heart, soul, and life force. Preserving one's name after death was a guarantee of eternal life. If the name was spoken by the living or written on the walls of a tomb or sarcophagus, the deceased continued to exist in the afterlife. Conversely, the destruction of a name was equivalent to final and complete death, to erasure from existence. Therefore, the curse of memory was the most terrible punishment imaginable. It was applied to the most hated enemies of the state: traitors, criminals, usurpers, and overthrown rulers. It was an official, state-sanctioned procedure. Special teams of workers were sent to temples and tombs to remove cartouches bearing the name of the cursed from all monuments throughout the country. One of the most famous examples of such a curse in Egyptian history was the posthumous fate of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who attempted to introduce the cult of the single god Aten. After his death, priests and subsequent pharaohs made tremendous efforts to to destroy all mention of him and his reforms. His name was cut from the royal lists, his temples were destroyed, and his statues were smashed. Another famous victim was the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. Her stepson, Thutmose III, upon ascending the throne, for reasons that remain unknown, ordered the destruction of her images and names in an attempt to erase her reign from history. The logic behind this action was simple and ruthless. No name, no person. No memory on earth means no life in heaven. It was probably this logic that was applied to the family of the last independent pharaoh of Egypt. The destruction of the names of Nefertiti and Akhenaten was not a random act of vandalism in the heat of battle. It was a cold, calculated political act aimed at completely delegitimizing the fallen dynasty. The conquerors were saying, these people had no right to power. They were nobodies, and therefore their names should not remain in eternity. Perhaps this was done on the direct orders of Cambyses, who, as we know from sources, was not shy about using harsh methods. Or it could have been done after his departure from Egypt to demonstrate loyalty to the Persian authorities. It is interesting that not all the hieroglyphs on the sarcophagi were destroyed. General phrases such as, "May he live forever," or references to the gods were left untouched. Only personal names and titles were erased. This suggests that the goal was not to desecrate the sarcophagus as a sacred object, but specifically to kill the personality of its owner. This makes the crime even more sinister. The vandal was not an atheist. He believed in the power of ritual and sacred texts, but he used this belief to commit the ultimate act of revenge, depriving a person of his afterlife. Thus, the gouges on the dark stone of the sarcophagi in the Hermitage are not just damage. They are traces of one of the most cruel punishments in human history. They are an echo of an ancient curse that has reached us through 2,500 years. Let's take a moment to distract ourselves from the bloody dramas of history and focus on the material from which these silent witnesses are made. The stone from which the sarcophagi of Nakhtastetru and Yakhmes were carved is itself part of this story and adds new and important details to it. The sarcophagi are not made of granite or limestone, but of grauwacke. This word may seem unfamiliar, but for the ancient Egyptians, this stone had a special meaning. Grauwacke is a very hard, fine-grained sedimentary rock, a type of sandstone, but cemented so firmly that its properties are similar to those of basalt. Its color varies from gray to dark green and almost black, like the Hermitage exhibits. The main deposit of this stone in Egypt was located in the desert, in a place called Wadi Hammamat. It was a harsh, waterless valley, halfway between the Nile and the Red Sea. To extract the stone, it was necessary to organize entire expeditions, equip thousands of workers, soldiers, and craftsmen, and deliver water and food. Only the pharaohs could afford this. Therefore, objects made of grauwacke, especially monumental ones such as sarcophagi, were an exclusive luxury available only to the highest elite. The choice of material alone was a sign of status, but it was not just a matter of prestige. Grauwacke is an incredibly difficult material to work with. It is very hard and viscous. It took months, if not years, of painstaking work to carve a multi-ton sarcophagus from a single block, then polish it to a mirror finish and cover it with the finest hieroglyphic carvings. The craftsmen used primitive copper and bronze tools that quickly became blunt, as well as abrasive powders such as quartz sand. It was hellish work that required the highest skill and endless patience. Now let's return to the damage to our sarcophagi. Understanding how strong and hard Grauwacke is makes us look at this act of vandalism in a new light. Chipping names off such stone is not the same as scraping an inscription off plaster. It required considerable effort, time, and the right tools. The vandal must have come to the tomb not empty-handed. He needed a heavy hammer and a sturdy chisel, possibly made of hardened bronze or iron. He had to strike each hieroglyph dozens, if not hundreds, of times with strong, precise blows. It was a long and noisy job. This once again dismisses the theory of accidental robbers, who are always in a hurry, and it underscores the cold, methodical fury of whoever did this. He didn't just wave his arm and make a couple of chips for show. He labored, putting his hatred into every blow, until the sacred name was reduced to an ugly wound on the body of the stone. The hardness of the Grauwacke, which was supposed to ensure the eternity of the sarcophagi, played a cruel joke in this case. It did not save the names, but it preserved for us the traces of their destruction in the smallest details. We can see how the tool entered the stone, how small pieces broke off. The stone that witnessed the creation of these masterpieces also witnessed their desecration. It saw the hands of the craftsmen who lovingly carved signs of life on it, and it saw the hands of the destroyers who hatefully carved signs of death on it. And this silent, dark stone carried the memory of both events through 2,500 years to tell us this story in the halls of the Hermitage. So, the curse was fulfilled. The names were erased, and the tombs were most likely plundered. For many centuries, the sarcophagi of Nachtbastetru and Jacques were plunged into darkness and oblivion, like Egypt itself, which passed from hand to hand, from the Persians to the Greeks, from the Greeks to the Romans. The ancient religion died, the hieroglyphs were forgotten, and no one could read the surviving spells, let alone understand the tragedy of the erased names. It was not until the 19th century, after Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, that Europe rediscovered this ancient civilization. A real Egyptomania began. Wealthy travelers, adventurers, and the first archaeologists rushed to the Nile Valley in search of treasures and antiquities. Museums in Europe and America competed with each other to see who could assemble the most impressive collection. Russia did not stand aside. There is no precise information about how and when the sarcophagi of Nathbastetru and Jacques were found. Most likely, they were discovered in the area of Memphis or Saqqara, where the main necropolises of that era were located. In the mid-19th century, they were acquired for his collection by Russian merchant and patron Alexander Sergeyevich Norov. He was a passionate collector and one of the first Russians to undertake a long and dangerous journey through Egypt and the Middle East. He bought antiquities to donate them to Russian museums. The journey of these multi-ton colossi from the Egyptian desert to St. Petersburg was an epic adventure in itself. They had to be carefully removed from the tomb, loaded onto carts, transported to the Nile, then shipped to Alexandria, and from there across the Mediterranean and Baltic Seas to the cold Russian port. One can only imagine the difficulties faced by the engineers and workers of that time. Finally, they arrived in St. Petersburg, and initially ended up not in the Hermitage, but in the Museum of the Academy of Arts. At that time, Egyptian antiquities were viewed primarily as examples of exotic art. It was only later, when Egyptology emerged as a serious science, that they were transferred to the Hermitage, where they took their place of honor in the specially created Egyptian Hall. It was here that Vladimir Golenishtchev saw them. By that time, Jean-François Champollion had already deciphered the hieroglyphs, and scholars were able to read the ancient texts. Golenishtchev, a brilliant expert in the Egyptian language, was able to read the surviving inscriptions and restore the names and titles of the sarcophagi's owners. He was also the first to compare the facts: the time when the sarcophagi were created, the end of the reign of Amasis, their high status, and the traces of deliberate destruction of the names. He linked this to the Persian conquest and the actions of Cambyses, laying the foundation for the hypothesis that we consider to be the main one today. Thus, after almost 2,500 years, justice began to be restored. Thanks to the work of the scientist, the curse of memory imposed by the ancient tyrant failed. The names of Nakhtastetru and Yakhmes were heard again, first in the silence of the offices, and then in the echoing halls of the museum. Their story was rescued from oblivion. But, as is often the case in the Hermitage, the solution to one mystery was only the prologue to another. It turned out that the erased names on the royal sarcophagi were not the only mystery kept by the Egyptian mummies and tombs in the heart of St. Petersburg. Deep in the museum's storerooms, another mystery was waiting to be solved, involving identity theft and an incredible discovery made in the 21st century. The story we have told is a classic detective story from the world of archaeology, where the clues are chips on stone and the witnesses are ancient historians. But the Hermitage is not just a museum, it is a living scientific organism, and sometimes the most striking discoveries are made not in field expeditions, but in the silence of laboratories and storerooms, decades or even centuries after an exhibit has entered the museum. Let's leave the majestic but empty sarcophagi of Nakhtastet and Yakhmes for a moment and turn to another, no less interesting exhibit. It is a complex of 3 nested sarcophagi and the mummy that rested in them. For almost a century since its arrival at the museum, this exhibit had a clear and seemingly unshakable attribution. It was believed to be the mummy of a woman named Babat. According to the inscriptions on the sarcophagus, she was a temple singer of the god Amun and lived in Thebes in the 7th century BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Psamtik III, founder of the 26th dynasty, to which Amasis also belonged. The fate of a temple singer seemed clear and even romantic. These women held a special position in Egyptian society. They participated in temple rituals, sang, and played musical instruments to appease the gods. Their profession was honorable. The mummy of Babat was one of the few well-preserved mummies in the Hermitage collection, and, along with the mummy of the priest, Padiist, was one of the symbols of the Egyptian collection. For decades, tour guides told visitors the story of the singer from ancient Thebes. Her name appeared in all catalogs and scientific publications. No one questioned that the richly decorated sarcophagus contained the remains of the woman whose name was written on it. However, there is always room for doubt in museum work. Experienced curators and restorers know that the history of many exhibits is full of confusion. This is especially true for items that entered collections in the 19th or early 20th centuries, when record-keeping was not as strict and research methods were not as sophisticated. Some suspicions arose. Why did the mummy, which was believed to be female, have some anthropological features that were not entirely typical of a woman? Why did some of the burial items seem strange for the burial of a singer? But these were only guesses that could not be verified without damaging the priceless exhibit. The mummy was tightly wrapped, and modern science only allows the opening of ancient shrouds in the most exceptional cases. It is a barbaric method that destroys more information than it reveals. For a long time, the mystery of the singer Babet remained unsolved. The mummy continued to lie in its sarcophagus, keeping its secret under many layers of tarred linen. But 21st century technology came to the aid of museum workers. A way was found to look inside the mummy without touching it or removing a single bandage. This method is medical computed tomography. In 2017, it was decided to conduct a unique study. The mummy of Babet, along with her sarcophagus, was carefully packed and sent on a short journey from the halls of the Hermitage to one of St. Petersburg's clinics, equipped with the most modern tomograph. Scientists and doctors waited with bated breath. They hoped to learn more about the health, diet, and age of the ancient Egyptian woman. But none of them could have imagined the shocking surprise that awaited them. The machine was started, and the first layer-by-layer images began to appear on the computer screen. What they saw turned everything upside down. Before we find out what the tomograph revealed, it is worth delving a little deeper into the history of the museum's confusion. How could the mistake have happened in the first place? Why was the mummy not in its sarcophagus, or the sarcophagus not with its mummy? The answer, as is often the case, lies in the turbulent events of Russian history in the early 20th century. Before the revolution of 1917, the core of the Egyptian collection, including most of the mummies, was not kept in the Winter Palace. It was considered inappropriate to keep dead bodies, even ancient ones, in the imperial residence next to the chambers of the ruling family. Therefore, the most naturalistic exhibits were kept in another famous St. Petersburg museum, the Kunstkamera, founded by Peter the Great. After the revolution, when the Winter Palace was finally turned into a public museum, it was decided to bring all the Egyptian antiquities together under the roof of the Hermitage. The complex process of transporting the collections began. This took place during the difficult and chaotic years of the Civil War and post-war devastation. The accounting and documentation were not always perfect. In this turmoil, as researchers now believe, a fatal mistake could have been made. One of the museum workers at the time, while packing or unpacking boxes, could have simply mixed up the mummies and sarcophagi. For example, they could have put a mummy from one box into a sarcophagus from another. It's easy to imagine several sarcophagi from the same era, several mummies of approximately the same size, the human factor multiplied by historical upheavals. There was another version. The confusion could have happened even earlier, in Egypt itself, in the 19th century, before the collection was sent to Russia. Antiquities dealers were not always scrupulous and could put together a set of a sarcophagus and a mummy found in different places simply to sell it for a higher price. In any case, for decades, no one suspected a substitution. The mummy lay in the sarcophagus of the singer Babet and was considered to be the singer Babet. She was tightly wrapped, and her appearance gave no obvious cause for suspicion. Egyptian embalming and wrapping techniques had reached such heights that the mummy was transformed into a kind of cocoon. This cocoon, consisting of dozens of layers of linen fabric soaked in resins and incense, created an almost airtight shell around the body. It not only preserved the remains from decay, but also reliably hid them from prying eyes. This thick shroud, which was supposed to protect the body for eternal life, also became the keeper of a century-old secret. It hid the truth not only from looters and time, but also from several generations of scientists. The voice of truth, the voice of the body itself, buried under these shrouds, could not break through. To hear it, a special tool was needed, one capable of seeing the invisible. And that tool was a medical tomograph. The scan took only 47 seconds, but those 47 seconds erased 100 years of museum history. Beam by beam, the machine shone through the ancient cocoon, creating a detailed three-dimensional model of everything inside on a computer. Scientists were able to virtually remove the layers, one by one, look under the skin, and see the bones and internal organs that had been preserved after embalming. And the first thing they saw made them gasp. The process of computed tomography itself is like a miracle, like 21st century magic. It's as if we've gained the X-ray vision of ancient gods, able to penetrate any barrier. For Egyptologists, this was a real revolution, comparable to the deciphering of hieroglyphics. There is no longer any need to open sarcophagi, let alone unwrap mummies. They can be studied while remaining completely intact. The machine essentially takes hundreds and thousands of X-ray slices of the object from different angles. Then a powerful computer assembles these two-dimensional slices into a single three-dimensional model. As a result, the researcher sees a virtual copy of the mummy on the screen, which can be rotated, viewed from any angle, enlarged, and even cut in any place to see what is inside. This provides a tremendous amount of information. It is possible to determine the sex and exact age of the person at the time of death. It is possible to see the condition of their bones and teeth and diagnose diseases they suffered from, such as arthritis, osteochondrosis, and tooth decay. It is possible to detect arrowheads stuck in the bones or traces of healed fractures that reveal their lifestyle. It is even possible to study the internal organs, or rather, what remains of them after embalming. The Egyptians, as is well known, removed the brain through the nose and the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines through an incision in the abdomen. They embalmed these organs separately and placed them in special vessels called canopic jars, but the heart, which was considered the seat of the mind and emotions, was usually left in the body. Tomography allows us to see all this in minute detail. What's more, we can even see the artifacts inside the shrouds. Embalmers often placed various amulets between the layers of fabric to protect the deceased. These could be images of scarabs, the eyes of the god Horus, or figures of Horus's sons. In the past, the shrouds had to be destroyed to find these amulets. Now they can be seen on the screen, and their material and location can be determined with precision. This is exactly what happened that day in the St. Petersburg clinic. On the computer screen, layer by layer, the body hidden under the shrouds of the singer Babat appeared. Here are the contours of the skull. Here is the spine. Here are the ribs. Scientists pored over the details, and with every second their amazement grew. The anatomy of the skeleton left no room for doubt. In a sarcophagus intended for a woman, a mummy had been lying for 100 years. A man's mummy. The pelvis, the structure of the skull, the overall massiveness of the bones, everything clearly indicated male gender. The initial shock was replaced by jubilation. This was not a fiasco, but a grand discovery. A century-old mistake had been discovered and corrected. But who was this mysterious stranger? If it wasn't Babat, then who was it? Now came the most interesting part, trying to identify this person. It was necessary to return to the museum archives and compare the data. After all, if Babat's mummy turned out to be a man, then somewhere in the Hermitage collection there had to be an extra male sarcophagus from the same era, which might have been his real home. And such a sarcophagus was found. In the museum storerooms there was indeed a sarcophagus that was considered empty. It belonged to a man named Pakesh, and now all the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The light that penetrated through the millennia and layers of linen did not simply expose an old mistake. It gave scientists the key to restoring the true story of two people whose fates accidentally intertwined in the museum halls. So, the discovery had been made. The mysterious impostor who had been posing as the temple singer Babat for almost a century had revealed his true identity. It was a man, and now that scientists had a prime suspect for his identity, a certain Pakesh, the owner of the orphaned sarcophagus, the investigation gained new momentum. It had to be proven that the mummy and Pakesh's sarcophagus really belonged together. To do this, the scientists compared all the available data. First, the era. Both the Babat sarcophagus and the Pakesh sarcophagus dated from approximately the same time, the 7th century BC, and came from the same place, Thebes. This made confusion during transport quite likely. Second, the dimensions. The mummy fit perfectly into the dimensions of the Pakesh sarcophagus. But the main evidence was the embalming and swaddling technique itself, which was studied using tomography. The style of mummification, the materials used, and the placement of amulets all changed over time and had their own characteristics in different periods and social classes. Analysis showed that the mummy had been treated in strict accordance with the canon's characteristic of the burial of a middle-ranking male priest in the 7th century BC. This was entirely consistent with the status of Pakesha, whose titles were indicated on his sarcophagus. Thus, there was no doubt left. The singer Babat was finally reincarnated as the priest Pakesha. The main discovery turned the museum's entire understanding of this exhibit upside down. The news spread around the world. An Egyptian mummy in the Hermitage has changed its gender and name. It was a triumph for Russian science and a wonderful example of how modern technology can help correct the mistakes of the past and rewrite history. But who was this Pakes? What else did the all-seeing eye of the tomograph reveal about him? The results were no less exciting than the revelation itself. First, scientists were able to determine his age with high accuracy. At the time of his death, Pakesh was about 35 to 40 years old. For ancient Egypt, this was already a mature age. Second, his health. Surprisingly, a man who lived almost 3,000 years ago had almost all of his teeth, 30 of them, and they were in excellent condition, with no signs of tooth decay. This speaks not only to good genetics and, possibly, diet, but also to the supreme skill of the embalmers who were able to preserve them in such a state. However, not everything was so smooth. Tomography revealed that Pakes had serious spinal problems, characteristic of modern humans, including severe osteochondrosis in the cervical and lumbar regions. He probably suffered from back pain, but the most intriguing discovery concerned his social status and physiological characteristics. Analysis of bones and soft tissues, as well as some specific details of the burial rites, led scientists to believe that Pakes may have been a eunuch. This hypothesis seems quite plausible. Eunuchs often served in the courts of pharaohs and in temple households, occupying high and trusted positions. If Pakesh was indeed castrated, this would explain some of the peculiarities of his skeleton and his priestly status. He was not just a priest, but probably a palace servant, a man close to the pharaoh. Thus, from the faceless singer Babat, a very specific person with a unique destiny emerged before us. A middle-aged man, a priest, possibly a eunuch, who suffered from back pain but had a Hollywood smile. The story hidden beneath the shroud turned out to be much more complicated and interesting than expected. Let's try to piece together all the fragments of this mosaic and reconstruct the life of the man known to us as Pakesh. He lived in the 7th century BC in Thebes during the 26th dynasty of Sayas. It was a time when Egypt, having thrown off the Assyrian yoke, was experiencing its last period of independence and cultural revival under the rule of the pharaohs from the city of Sayas. Although Thebes had ceded political primacy to the cities of the Delta, it remained the main religious center of the country. The heart of the cult of the god Amun-Ra, Pakesh, judging by his titles, was a priest, but not just any priest. The inscriptions on his sarcophagus refer to him as the gatekeeper of the temple of Amun. At first glance, the position of gatekeeper may not seem very important, but in the complex hierarchy of the Egyptian priesthood, it was an important and responsible position. Temple gatekeepers were not just guards. They controlled access to sacred precincts, monitored ritual purity, and participated in ceremonies. They were trusted individuals. The hypothesis that Pakesh was a eunuch adds new colors to his image. In the ancient world, eunuchs often had brilliant careers. Deprived of the opportunity to have their own families and dynasties, they were considered absolutely loyal to their master, whether king or god. They served in harems, were treasurers, scribes, tutors to royal children, and priests. If Pakesh was indeed a eunuch, his service in the temple of Amun may have been only part of his duties. It is highly likely, as suggested by Hermitage scholars, that he served at the court of Pharaoh Psamtik. His life was spent between two worlds, the world of the gods, whom he served in the Karnak temple, and the world of men, whom he served in the pharaoh's palace. It was a life full of rituals, ceremonies, and undoubtedly court intrigues. He witnessed the great construction projects undertaken by Psamtik, saw Greek mercenaries and merchants arrive in Egypt, bringing with them new ideas and trends. He watched as the country, recently ravaged by the Assyrians, once again became a great power. His physical condition, which we know thanks to tomography, also tells us about his life. Healthy teeth may indicate access to high-quality food that did not contain coarse abrasive particles, such as sand, which were the scourge of the common people and led to rapid enamel erosion. This is further indirect confirmation of his high status. However, his back problems, osteochondrosis, could have been an occupational hazard. Long hours spent on his feet during temple services, or, conversely, sedentary work as a scribe could have led to back pain. At the age of about 40, Pakesh's life was cut short. The cause of his death is unknown to us. Tomography revealed no signs of violence or fatal diseases. After his death, his body was handed over to skilled embalmers. They performed all the necessary rituals with the utmost care to ensure his eternal life. His body was treated, wrapped in expensive linen shrouds, between which protective amulets were placed. Then the mummy was placed in a magnificent, brightly painted anthropomorphic sarcophagus, which was to become his home for eternity. He did everything to ensure his immortality. And in a sense, he achieved it. But he could not have imagined the tortuous path his remains would take. Through oblivion, confusion, a century under a false name, and finally, the triumphant return of his identity thanks to technologies that would have seemed like the most incredible magic to him. The discovery of the true identity of the Pa-Kesha mummy was not just a curious fact. It had far-reaching consequences for the museum itself, for its catalogs, exhibitions, and scientific work. It was a case where a single piece of research forced a whole chapter in the history of a famous collection to be rewritten. First of all, it was necessary to officially debunk the singer Babat. Her story, which had been told to visitors for decades, turned out to be a museum myth. Now the tour guides had to tell a completely different story. The story of the priest Pa-Kesha and the amazing scientific detective who restored his name. This required updating all informational materials, labels in the hall, articles on the website, guidebooks, and catalogs. This is painstaking but very important work, which shows that a museum is not a static repository of antiquities, but a living, evolving organism where history is constantly being refined and supplemented. Secondly, the separated parts had to be reunited. Pa-Kesha's mummy now had to be associated with his own sarcophagus. But what to do with the sarcophagus of the singer Babat? It was left widowed. Where was her own mummy? Most likely, it was lost in the 19th century, or in the chaos of the post-revolutionary years, or maybe it still lies in some other museum in the world, also under someone else's name, waiting for its moment and its tomograph. This story is a wonderful illustration of how much hidden information museum exhibits contain. We are used to looking at them as works of art or historical artifacts, but behind each of them lies a human destiny. And modern scientific methods allow us not only to study the techniques of their manufacture or iconography, but also to enter into a direct dialogue with people from the past. We can learn about their illnesses, their diet, their lifestyle, and even, as in the case of Pa-Kesh, correct historical injustices by restoring a person's true identity. This discovery was also of great importance for Egyptology worldwide. It once again demonstrated the enormous potential of non-invasive research methods. The success of the Hermitage scientists inspired their colleagues in other museums around the world to conduct similar research on their collections. Who knows how many more imposters are hiding in sarcophagi around the world? How many more discoveries await us? This case also forced us to take a fresh look at the history of museum collections in the 19th century. It reminded us that behind the romantic aura of great discoveries often lay chaotic excavations, sloppy documentation, and dubious deals by antique dealers. Many of the exhibits that found their way into museums during that era have dark spots in their biographies, and modern researchers must be especially careful to check and double-check seemingly long-established facts. Thus, a single scan, which took less than a minute, set off a chain reaction that affected the exhibition, scientific research, and our understanding of history. The priest Pa-Kesh, who found his name, unwittingly became a symbol of a new era in museum work. An era where science and technology allow us to hear voices that have been silent for millennia. We began our journey with two monumental, almost black sarcophagi, keeping the secret of erased names. We immersed ourselves in the drama of the last days of independent Egypt, in a story of conquest, revenge, and an ancient curse of memory. Then, like archaeologists, we moved on to another cultural layer and discovered a second mystery: the secret of a mummy who had lived for 100 years under a false name. At first glance, these two stories seem completely different. One is about members of a royal dynasty who fell victim to high politics and imperial ambitions. The other is about a mid-ranking priest whose identity was lost due to negligence and historical turmoil. One mystery was solved thanks to classical Egyptology, analysis of texts, and historical sources. The other thanks to ultra-modern medical technology. But if you look closely, there is a deep connection between these two stories. Both are about the fragility of human memory and identity, and both are about the tireless human desire to preserve that memory and restore that identity. Nathbastetru and Yakmes, by ordering their indestructible sarcophagi made of grauwacke, sought to ensure their eternal memory. Cambyses, or whoever acted on his orders, sought to destroy that memory by erasing their names. The priest, Pakesh, undergoing the most complex embalming rituals, also sought to preserve his essence for eternity. And an unnamed museum employee, having mixed up the mummies, unwittingly condemned him to a century of oblivion. Both stories show that the Egyptian Hall of the Hermitage is not just a repository of ancient corpses and beautiful objects. It is a space for dialogue. Dialogue between the past and the present, between silent artifacts and inquisitive researchers. These sarcophagi and mummies are not passive objects of study. They constantly ask us questions. Who are we? What will remain after us? What is memory? Can you kill a person by erasing their name? And can you bring them back to life by restoring their name 3,000 years later? We are still searching for answers to these questions, and every new discovery, whether it be the deciphering of a damaged inscription or the results of a tomographic scan, raises new questions. We have solved the mystery of the damage to the sarcophagi of Yakmes and Nachtbastet, but we will never know for sure who wielded the hammer and chisel. We have restored the name of Pakesu, but we still do not know where the body of the singer Babat lies. The story is not over. The dialogue continues. And every time we enter this hall and look into the dark eye sockets of the anthropomorphic sarcophagi, we must remember that what we see before us are not just stones and dried-up bodies. Before us are destinies. Destinies full of drama, tragedy, and surprising twists. And perhaps the main mystery of the Egyptian sarcophagi in the Hermitage lies in the fact that, having survived for thousands of years, they force us, the people of the 21st century, to think about things that are beyond the power of time, about life, death, and the eternal struggle for the right to remain in the memory of future generations.